At my sister's wedding, my seat wasn't inside the ballroom, it was outside in the hallway, right next to the trash cans. Everyone else laughed, under chandeliers, while I sat by the service doors, listening to the music through the glass. My sister smiled at me once, proud of where she'd placed me. I picked up my gift, stood, and walked out without saying a word. 5 minutes later, the music stopped. Someone screamed, and every guest in that perfect room learned why I'd really come to the wedding. The day began with polished shoes, perfect hair, and a quiet hope that maybe this time would feel different. I had driven for hours to reach the lakeside resort where my sister's wedding was being held. The parking lot gleamed with expensive cars, each one belonging to someone who mattered more than me. I stepped out of my modest car, adjusted my dress, and tried to shake off the familiar sense of being an outsider at my own family's event. The sun shimmered on the lake, but the warmth never quite reached me. Inside the venue, people moved like clockwork, polished and rehearsed. Guests hugged and exchanged stories, while photographers chased perfect angles. I slipped in quietly, unnoticed, scanning for a familiar face. My mother stood by the entryway, laughing too loudly with relatives she pretended to like. My father hovered near the bar, checking his watch, as if time spent here was an inconvenience. I waved, but neither of them turned. It was a dance we had perfected over years, me reaching out, them pretending not to see. Still, I smiled and walked toward the seating chart. The board stood like a monument of importance, covered in elegant calligraphy and flowers. I traced the rows of names until I found mine near the very bottom corner. The location didn't register at first, but as I followed the directions, my steps slowed. The path led past the main ballroom doors, past the rows of tables covered in gold linen, and into the narrow hallway where service staff carried trays and clattered dishes. That's where I saw it. A single folding chair, beside a trash bin, and a stack of cleaning supplies. That was my seat. The hallway smelled like lilies mixed with cleaner. The sound of laughter and clinking glasses seeped through the double doors. Every time the staff pushed through, I caught a glimpse of chandeliers and soft candlelight. I could see the back of my sister's white dress as she posed for photos, glowing in the kind of attention she was born to receive. The draft near my chair made me shiver, but I stayed seated, too proud to move and too tired to make a scene. I held my gift tighter, wondering if anyone even realized where they'd placed me. My mother passed by once, pretending to check her phone. Her pearls caught the light as she avoided my eyes. My father followed behind, his jaw stiff, expression blank. Neither said a word. It wasn't anger that filled me then. It was recognition. This was exactly who they were. The family who always celebrated one child while forgetting the other. I could almost hear my mother's favorite phrase from childhood repeating in my head. Be grateful, don't complain. I smiled bitterly and stared at the silver box resting on my lap. It deserved better company than this hallway. I thought back to growing up in our small town, how my sister Paige always got the spotlight. Every award, every photo, every story began with her name. I was the quiet one, the helper, the background figure, who made sure things stayed smooth. Teachers said I was dependable. My parents called me easy. Both words meant the same thing, forgettable. Even as adults, nothing changed. She became the adored daughter with the picture-perfect fiancé. I became the polite shadow, invited out of obligation. I used to tell myself it didn't matter, but sitting there, it did. I remembered finding my mother's journal a few years back, tucked in her vanity drawer. Every page began with my sister's name. Her milestones, her joys, her memories. Not one word about me. Not a single mention. That discovery had burned quietly, like a wound that never closed. I had put the journal back exactly where I found it and never brought it up. I thought time would dull the sting, but it hadn't. Sitting in that cold hallway, I realized that wound had never healed because it was still being opened, one small insult at a time. Through the glass doors, Paige glowed under the lights, the image of perfection. The photographer circled her, as if she were royalty. My parents hovered nearby, proud and attentive. I was used to watching from the edges, but this time the edges had turned into exile. Every laugh, every toast, every dance was on the other side of that wall. I felt like a ghost attending my own family's event. Even the waitstaff hesitated to make eye contact, unsure if I belonged there or was simply lost. Maybe they were right. I didn't belong there at all. As the ceremony moved into speeches, I could hear fragments through the door. People toasted to love, family, and how lucky Paige was to have found someone so perfect. The irony wasn't lost on me. I looked down at the gift in my lap, a silver box wrapped with care. Inside, it wasn't just a present. It carried the truth that would change everything. I traced the ribbon and thought about how many years I'd stayed quiet to protect this family's image. Maybe today, that silence had finally reached its limit. Maybe I didn't need to protect them anymore. I leaned back against the wall and took a slow breath, steadying my thoughts. Outside, the sky was dimming, turning the lake into a mirror of light and shadow. Through the narrow glass window, I saw my sister's reflection and my own, separated by a wall and a lifetime of distance. One adored, one ignored. I wondered if she ever noticed the difference or if she truly believed I didn't care. My fingers tightened around the box again. Maybe I cared too much. Maybe that's what made it hurt every single time. But not this time. Not anymore. A waiter stopped briefly to toss a napkin into the bin beside me. He offered a faint, apologetic smile before disappearing through the doors again. The music shifted to something soft and elegant, signaling the first dance. My chest felt heavy, not from sadness, but from the quiet certainty that this would be my last family event. I wasn't leaving in anger, just truth. They had already decided where I belonged, outside. I decided to stay there on my own terms. I placed the box on the floor beside me and stared at it, thinking of everything it held. The gift had taken me hours to prepare, not because of the wrapping, but because of what was inside. 3 weeks earlier, I had met one of Paige's old co-workers for lunch. She spoke freely, assuming I already knew. She talked about how Paige had bragged for months about marrying into money, how she called her fiancé gullible, how she joked about manipulating him into signing papers that benefited her alone. I had listened quietly, the way I always did, but this time, I didn't brush it off. I asked for proof, and I got it. Screenshots, messages, dates, everything. When I got home that night, I printed the messages, each one more cruel than the last. I placed them neatly in an envelope and added a short note in my own handwriting. I didn't plan revenge, only truth. If she wanted to build her life on lies, that was her choice, but not without consequences. The silver box became my reminder of honesty, the kind that hurts before it heals. Sitting by the trash bins at her wedding, I finally understood what needed to happen. I wasn't ruining her big day. She had already done that herself. Inside the ballroom, laughter swelled as the couple cut their cake. My reflection wavered in the glass, calm and expressionless. I lifted the box from the floor and brushed the dust off the ribbon. Every detail felt deliberate, clean, and final. The box was light in weight, but heavy in meaning. I stood and straightened my dress, not out of vanity, but closure. I looked once more through the door at the family, who never saw me. Then I turned toward the entrance, where the gift table sat waiting beneath a wall of flowers and glittering lights. The coordinator was busy rearranging bouquets when I slipped in. Her clipboard hid my movement as I placed the silver box neatly among the other gifts, right at the top where it couldn't be missed. My handwriting on the tag looked steady and elegant, a contrast to how I felt inside. I stepped back, watching the box blend perfectly into the pile of presents. For the first time, I felt no need to explain myself. I had said everything I needed without speaking a word. I turned away, the sound of distant music fading behind me as I walked outside. Outside, the air felt sharper, cutting through the leftover perfume and noise of celebration. The sun had already started to fall behind the trees, leaving streaks of orange across the lake. I stood near the edge of the water for a moment, watching the reflection of lights shimmer. I didn't feel guilt or triumph, just a quiet certainty that something had finally shifted. Every time I had swallowed my voice to keep peace, it had cost me a piece of myself. Tonight, I was done trading silence for belonging that never truly existed. The faint sound of clapping drifted from inside, signaling the next part of the celebration. I walked to my car, parked a few rows down, and sat behind the wheel. My hands rested on the steering wheel, motionless. The cool leather against my palms grounded me. I thought about driving away immediately, but hesitated. I wanted one last look at the place where my family had chosen to make me invisible. The golden lights from the windows flickered against the darkening sky, making the entire resort look like a snow globe I had finally stepped out of. Inside that glass ballroom, my sister's perfect world was unfolding exactly as she planned. Guests would toast, photographers would capture her flawless smile, and my parents would beam with pride. It was a show, just like every family event had been. But now, I knew what was waiting inside that silver box, waiting to be unwrapped. I didn't need to stay to see it happen. The truth didn't require an audience. It only needed to exist. I started the car but didn't drive off yet, choosing to sit in the stillness while the night prepared to turn a page. My phone buzzed with a message from a coworker asking how the wedding was going. I typed beautiful, but never sent it. The word felt false on the screen. The truth was that I had reached the edge of something I couldn't return from. All my life, I had been told to forgive, to understand, to be the bigger person. No one ever asked my sister to do the same. She was celebrated for ambition. I was criticized for boundaries. As I stared through the windshield, the thought came simple and clear. Let them see what I've seen. The music from the ballroom carried faintly through the evening air, a mix of laughter and applause that no longer had any power over me. I watched the valet help a group of guests into their cars, their conversations full of joy and champagne. I wondered what they would say an hour from now when everything changed. I turned my phone off and set it face down beside me. For once, I didn't want to explain anything. My silence would speak louder than every word I'd ever held back. If you've ever been made to feel invisible by your own family, you'll understand what came next. This moment wasn't about revenge, it was about release. And if you're still here with me, take a second to support the story. Like the video, subscribe if you haven't, and comment where you're watching from. It helps more than you think. And keep stories like this alive, because sometimes we all need to be reminded that walking away can be the most powerful thing a person can do. I stayed parked near the edge of the lot, lights off, engine idling softly. The lake mirrored the ballroom's glow, calm but deceptive. From here, I could almost see the silhouettes of the guests moving inside. Each shadow told a story of pride, denial, or comfort built on lies. I thought about the years spent playing my role quietly, making space for everyone else's joy while swallowing my own. Every holiday, every birthday, every gathering, it had been the same script. I had stopped believing it could ever change. That belief ended the moment I left that hallway. I remembered the first time I realized favoritism wasn't just imagined. It was during school, when our parents forgot to attend my science fair, but flew across the state for my sister's cheer competition. I came home holding a certificate. No one asked to see. Mom had framed Paige's ribbons within a day. Mine stayed folded in a drawer for years. Those memories lived quietly inside me. Not bitter, but unresolved. The wedding only replayed the same story in a more expensive setting. The difference now was that I finally recognized the pattern for what it was: habit, not love. The car's interior filled with the faint scent of pine from an old air freshener. I rolled the window halfway down, letting the cool air slip inside. In the distance, I saw waitstaff hurrying around, preparing for the next course. They didn't know they were about to witness something that would end the night differently than anyone planned. My chest felt light for the first time in a long while. I didn't wish harm on my sister. I only wanted honesty to catch up with her. Whatever happened after that wasn't mine to control anymore. When I was little, I used to believe that being kind meant being quiet. I thought that if I stayed helpful and patient, eventually people would see me. They never did. They only grew comfortable with my silence. That belief shaped years of decisions, including coming to this wedding. I hadn't realized until that moment that I was still hoping to be seen, even after all this time. The truth was, some families only notice you when you stop playing your assigned role. Mine was about to learn that lesson the hard way. Through the glass windows, the scene inside looked like perfection. My sister in her white gown, her husband beside her, guests laughing, parents glowing with pride. Every inch of it looked like success. But under the surface, It was built on the kind of lies people tell themselves to sleep at night. The silver box on that table was small, almost unnoticeable among the other gifts. Yet it held the one thing my family had never valued: truth. I knew once it was opened, no amount of pretending could hold their version of perfection together again. I leaned my head against the seat, listening to the faint hum of the car engine. I didn't know exactly how the scene would unfold inside, but I could imagine it clearly. My sister's forced smile fading, her husband's confusion turning into realization, my mother's pearls trembling as she grasped the truth she'd ignored for years. It wasn't fantasy. It was inevitability. Every lie finds daylight sooner or later. I hadn't brought this to hurt anyone. I had brought it because some truths don't belong buried forever, not even for the sake of family appearances. As minutes passed, I checked the rearview mirror and saw guests walking toward the terrace for group photos. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly, replaced by soft string lights outside. Everything looked serene, but I knew the calm wouldn't last long. My sister always believed her charm could smooth over anything. She'd laugh, cry a little, and everyone would forgive her again. But printed words and screenshots couldn't be undone by tears. The proof inside that box was undeniable. For once, she couldn't twist the story to make herself the victim. Truth would do the talking now. I thought about the silver box resting among the other gifts and how symbolic it felt. My entire life, my contributions had been overlooked, but this small act would not be ignored. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was simple and exact. The weight of all those years of silence had been wrapped, tied, and left in plain sight. I imagined the moment the lid came off, the ripple it would send through the perfect illusion of the evening. Every person who had looked through me would finally have to see me, even if they didn't know it was me. The temperature dropped slightly as night settled over the lake. The reflection of the ballroom sparkled on the water like fragments of glass. I watched, detached, as laughter echoed faintly across the distance. I wondered if my parents were proud of the daughter they had chosen to celebrate. I also wondered if they'd ever question why they'd ignored the other one. Maybe they wouldn't. Some people only understand loss when it's public. I didn't need their apology anymore. Silence had been my burden for too long. Now it was my boundary. That thought felt strangely peaceful. I leaned back in my seat and closed my eyes for a few seconds. The weight of the day began to settle, not heavy, just final. Everything that needed to be done had been done. I didn't crave attention or validation. I only wanted truth to be seen for once. Somewhere deep inside, a small part of me hoped it might make my parents think differently about the way they treated me, but another part already knew it wouldn't. Some stories never change. I had written my own ending now, and it didn't require anyone else's approval. The sound of distant fireworks signaled another part of the celebration, probably for photos or toasts. I could almost picture the smiles, the raised glasses, the laughter hiding cracks. It was strange how easy it was to act happy when you'd been doing it your whole life. My sister had perfected it. My parents too. But honesty doesn't vanish. It waits, and that silver box was waiting right there on the table, among all the glitter and noise, ready to open when the right pair of hands reached for it. I didn't need to see it happen to know it would. I started the car again, thinking about leaving, but something in me wanted to stay a few more minutes. Maybe I needed to witness the last glow of that illusion before it disappeared forever. The lake breeze brushed through the open window, carrying faint bits of music. For a second, I almost felt pity for my sister. She had everything: beauty, charm, success. But none of it was real. It was built on the lies she told so easily that even she believed them. The truth she mocked for years was about to become the one thing she couldn't escape. My phone buzzed again, this time with a call from my mother. I let it ring until it stopped. The silence afterward felt good, almost cleansing. I didn't owe her an explanation. She had made her choices, just like I had made mine. The sound of laughter from the distance reminded me of how many times I had laughed along to hide discomfort. I wasn't playing that role anymore. Tonight, I had stepped out of their script completely. They could keep performing the same act without me. I had already written the ending. Inside the ballroom, the atmosphere shifted. I could tell, even from the faint change in music and lighting visible through the windows. Guests were moving around, gathering near the gift table. I sat up, watching closely. One of the bridesmaids pointed toward the stack of presents, and I saw someone pick up the silver box. It was small, distinct under the overhead light. My chest felt calm, almost steady. The truth was being carried to the center of the celebration where it belonged. Every lie has its moment of exposure. That moment had finally arrived for her. The doors opened briefly, as a waiter stepped out with empty trays, giving me a clearer view inside. The crowd was gathered near the couple. My sister's hand rested on her husband's arm, her face radiant under the chandelier. I imagined the box being placed in front of her, the ribbon untied with care, the laughter softening into curiosity into realization. The transformation was already happening. Inside that perfect bubble, reality was about to burst, and there was nothing I needed to add. I had already said everything I wanted without ever raising my voice. I could almost picture the sequence, the paper being peeled back, the note unfolding, the screenshots visible under the bright ballroom lights. It didn't matter who opened it first, the reaction would be the same: shock, silence, then truth. People always believe the pretty one until evidence arrives. For years, my sister's charm had been her shield, but no shield survives truth printed in ink. I imagined my mother's face tightening, my father's disappointment turning inward. Maybe they'd finally realize what I had known all along, that love without fairness isn't love at all. Another faint change in sound drifted from inside, like a note dropped in the middle of a song. The rhythm had broken. I could tell something was happening. My sister's voice used to fill every room, now it was gone, replaced by murmurs and shifting footsteps. The night air felt cooler, almost still. I didn't need to see the rest. Whatever was unraveling inside was inevitable. The truth doesn't need witnesses. It just needs to be released. I started the car again, headlights sweeping across the gravel path, ready to leave everything that had kept me small behind. As I turned the steering wheel, I caught one last glimpse of the ballroom through the rear window. Guests had stopped dancing. People were standing near the gift table, heads tilted, hands over their mouths. The scene looked frozen, like a photograph right before it breaks. The music was gone. All that remained was the faint echo of a voice raised in disbelief. I didn't feel satisfaction or triumph. I felt clarity. What I had done wasn't revenge. It was closure. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was finally setting myself free from a story that had never been mine. The road out of the resort curved along the lake, lined with old trees and quiet houses. My headlights cut through the darkness, lighting a path that felt new, even though I'd driven it before. I rolled the windows down, letting the cool air fill the car. Behind me, the resort lights flickered like distant stars. I didn't look back again. For the first time, I didn't need their approval, their apologies, or their attention. They could keep their perfect image. I had chosen something better, peace that didn't depend on anyone else recognizing it. The drive down the winding road felt longer than it was. I passed quiet cottages and pine trees swaying gently by the water. Each mile seemed to wash away a layer of something heavy I had carried for years. My phone stayed off, resting in the passenger seat as if keeping distance from the noise I had escaped. I thought about how many times I had been told to forgive and forget, how many times I had done it, but this time was different. I hadn't chosen anger. I had chosen truth, and truth didn't need forgiveness. Far behind me, the glow of the ballroom faded into darkness. I pictured it, guests frozen in disbelief, my sister's voice breaking as the facade cracked. Somewhere, my parents would be trying to contain the damage, to smooth things over like they always did. They would call it a misunderstanding or a mistake. They wouldn't see it for what it was, a lifetime of silence answering back. I wasn't cruel. I had just stopped pretending. Sometimes the quietest person in the room holds the sharpest truth. Tonight, that truth was no longer mine to carry alone. I stopped at a gas station halfway down the highway to clear my head. The fluorescent lights flickered above the pumps, humming softly. I filled the tank, then stood beside the car, staring at the reflection of my face in the glass window. I didn't look angry or vengeful. I looked calm. The kind of calm that comes when you finally stop chasing approval. For years, I thought peace came from keeping everyone happy. Now, standing under that cheap light, I realized it comes from refusing to be invisible anymore. I got back in the car and kept driving. The road opened into a long stretch of forest, the kind where the trees swallowed the sky. The rhythm of the tires on the asphalt felt steady, like a heartbeat. I didn't need music or distractions. The quiet was enough. My thoughts wandered back to the way my sister smiled earlier that day, full of pride and certainty. She had always believed she could outshine consequences. That confidence was her armor. But even armor cracks when the truth seeps in. Maybe one day she'd understand that being admired isn't the same as being loved. I had learned that long ago. When I finally reached the small motel I had booked for the night, the parking lot was empty, except for 2 cars. The sign buzzed faintly in the dark. Inside, the air smelled like old carpet and lemon cleaner, oddly comforting after the chaos of the resort. I checked in, dropped my bag, and sat on the edge of the bed. The stillness felt heavier here, but not in a bad way. It was the kind of stillness that asks for reflection. I let myself breathe, realizing I hadn't taken a full breath all day. It felt overdue. I turned on the lamp by the window and opened the curtains. The room overlooked the lake in the distance, faint light still visible from the resort. I wondered if the party had ended by now, or if the guests were still whispering about what had unfolded. Maybe they were scrolling through their phones, sharing the story with disbelief. My sister had always lived for attention, and now she had it in abundance, but not the kind she wanted. I didn't gloat. I just felt a quiet acceptance that every lie eventually circles back to its source. I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. My mind drifted through the years of small betrayals that had led here, missed birthdays, forgotten calls, comments that chipped away at me piece by piece. I had let each one slide because confronting them only made me the problem. Now the problem had confronted them on its own. I wasn't proud or ashamed. I was free. I realized that freedom doesn't come from leaving people. It comes from leaving their expectations behind. I finally understood why silence can be both a cage and a key, depending on how you use it. I turned off the lamp and lay in the dim glow from outside. The reflection of the lake shimmered faintly through the curtain. Somewhere out there, my family was probably still picking through the ruins of their perfect night. Maybe my mother was trying to call me again. Maybe my father was too tired to argue anymore. Either way, I didn't owe them answers. For once, they could sit with uncertainty. The same way I had for years. The difference was that uncertainty didn't scare me anymore. It just meant possibility, something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through the thin motel curtains. My first instinct was to reach for my phone, but I stopped. The peace of not knowing was better than any message waiting on the screen. I made coffee from the small machine in the corner and stood by the window, watching birds skim the surface of the lake. Everything looked ordinary, and that ordinariness felt perfect. For once, I wasn't defined by comparison or silence. I was just me, existing without needing to prove a thing. The world hadn't ended. It had just changed direction. After breakfast, I finally turned my phone back on. It buzzed non-stop, lighting up with missed calls and messages. There were texts from my mother, a few from numbers I didn't recognize, and one from my sister. I didn't open any of them. Each notification felt like a pull toward a world I no longer belonged to. I set the phone on silent and left it on the counter. Some stories didn't need new chapters. Some needed to end exactly where they broke. I poured another cup of coffee and let the quiet remind me that endings can be peaceful too. I packed my bag and checked out of the motel. The clerk gave me a polite smile, unaware of the storm that had passed less than a mile away. Outside, the morning air was cool and crisp. The lake shimmered under soft sunlight, calm and untouched, as if nothing had happened. I took a slow walk down to the edge of the water and sat on a bench. Ripples spread gently across the surface, carrying reflections of clouds and trees. Everything looked simple, almost pure. It was strange how peace could exist so close to chaos without either disturbing the other. As I sat there, I thought about how much of my life had revolved around seeking approval. I had measured my worth by how others saw me, by smiles, invitations, an acknowledgement that rarely came. I'd mistaken tolerance for love and attention for care. Now, none of it mattered. I didn't need validation to know my own value. The wedding had shown me what I had always feared to admit. Some families love control more than connection, and breaking that pattern doesn't destroy you. It saves you. For the first time, being alone didn't feel lonely. It felt honest. I pulled a small notepad from my bag and started writing, not to anyone but myself. The words flowed without planning, simple reflections, moments I didn't want to forget. I wrote about the hallway, the silver box, the decision to leave. I wrote about the peace that came afterward. Writing had always been my quiet rebellion, the way I processed the things I couldn't say aloud. Each word felt lighter, like laying down something heavy one page at a time. When I finished, I tore the page out and folded it neatly, keeping it as a reminder of closure. After leaving the lake, I stopped by a small roadside cafe for lunch. The place was quiet, filled with the soft hum of conversation and the smell of coffee. I sat near the window and ordered soup. The waitress smiled and asked if I was traveling alone. I nodded. She said it must feel freeing, and I realized she was right. Traveling without explaining myself, sitting without pretending, breathing without holding tension, it was all new. I didn't crave anyone's presence or approval. My own company was enough. The world outside kept moving, and I was finally moving with it. Back in the car, I turned on the radio for the first time that day. A soft song played, one I hadn't heard since childhood. It reminded me of the long drives my father used to take with me when my sister was busy performing somewhere. Those were rare moments of quiet connection, moments I now saw differently. He hadn't been unkind, just distant, shaped by a family that valued image over emotion. Understanding that didn't erase the hurt, but it softened it. Sometimes recognizing people's limits was its own kind of forgiveness. It didn't excuse them, but it freed me. I drove without a destination for a while, letting the road guide me through small towns and open fields. The landscape changed gradually from lakeside calm to stretches of farmland and distant hills. The horizon looked endless. I thought about how many years I had spent feeling confined by people who never really saw me. Now, with no one expecting anything, the world felt wide and full. Freedom didn't roar or announce itself. It whispered in small ways, in the hum of tires, the warmth of sunlight, and the knowledge that I could go anywhere without looking back. At a rest stop, I checked my phone again. Curiosity winning over restraint. Dozens of new messages filled the screen. My mother's texts were long and frantic, asking where I was and insisting we talk. My father's were shorter, just questions about whether I was safe. My sister's message sat unread at the bottom. I stared at her name for a long moment, then opened it. It was only 3 words. "You ruined everything." I read it once, smiled faintly, and deleted it. I hadn't ruined anything. I had simply exposed what was already broken. I tossed the phone back into the passenger seat and continued driving. The clouds above began to gather, heavy with rain. But the rhythm of the windshield wipers felt comforting when the first drops fell. The road shimmered under the soft drizzle, stretching endlessly ahead. Every mile between me and that wedding felt like a new start. I didn't have to chase peace anymore. I was already living it. For the first time in years, I felt like I was steering my life instead of waiting for permission to move forward. That alone was worth everything I'd done. When I stopped again for gas, I overheard 2 travelers talking near the counter about a wedding that had gone wrong at the resort up north. They mentioned a scandal, screenshots, and a crying bride. I didn't react. The story was already spreading beyond that small circle, as it always would. Truth has its own way of traveling fast. I paid for my fuel, smiled politely, and walked back to the car. Hearing strangers repeat, it felt strange, but satisfying. For once, I wasn't the one being talked over. My silence had spoken for me, and people were finally listening. The rain eased as I got back onto the highway. I rolled the windows down and let the cool air rush in, washing away the smell of the motel and coffee. The clouds parted slightly, revealing streaks of sunlight breaking through. The world felt open again, no longer weighed down by pretense or guilt. I realized how little I actually needed to feel content. A full tank, an open road, and a clear conscience. Everything else was decoration. I wasn't running from my family anymore. I was simply moving toward the kind of peace they could never give me. The further I drove, the smaller the wedding felt in my mind. What once felt like the center of my world now seemed like a tiny event buried in the past. I thought about all the years I had centered my worth on people who couldn't see it. The irony was that once I stopped trying to prove myself, I found clarity. I wasn't defined by their approval or absence anymore. I was defined by what I chose to hold on to, and I had chosen truth. It didn't fix everything, but it gave me a starting point I could trust. As afternoon turned to evening, I found myself pulling into a small coastal town. The air smelled like salt and rain, and gulls circled lazily above the docks. I hadn't planned to come here, but something about the calm drew me in. I parked near a cafe facing the water and sat watching waves break against the pier. The ocean had a way of putting everything into perspective. Its rhythm didn't change for anyone's chaos. It just kept moving, steady and endless. I realized that was what I wanted to become, unshaken by noise, steady in truth. I walked along the pier, the boards creaking under my shoes. Couples strolled past holding hands. Children chased each other near the railing, and an old man cast his fishing line into the gray water. None of them knew me, and that anonymity felt like a gift. For once, I wasn't the forgotten daughter or the quiet sister. I was simply another person passing through, living her own story. The sky began to clear slightly, letting a pale orange glow spill across the water. It wasn't dramatic, but it was beautiful in the way peace always is, quiet, earned. I found a small inn nearby and decided to stay for the night. The woman at the desk handed me a brass key and smiled warmly. The room overlooked the harbor, and the sound of the waves filled the space like background music. I sat by the window, watching the horizon fade into darkness. My reflection in the glass looked different, lighter, freer. The wedding, the family, the years of neglect, they all felt far away now. I hadn't escaped my life. I had reclaimed it, and that realization filled me with a calm I hadn't known in years. Before going to bed, I stood on the balcony and looked out at the quiet town. Lights from the boats flickered across the water like tiny fires. The air was cool, the kind that smells of salt and rain. I thought about what tomorrow might bring, but for once, I didn't feel anxious. I didn't need to plan, fix, or explain. My story had already found its ending, and it wasn't loud or dramatic. It was stillness. The same stillness I once feared had become my peace. I closed the door, turned off the light, and let the calm settle in. Morning light poured through the thin curtains, soft and steady. I brewed coffee and sat by the window, watching fishermen prepare their boats. The harbor came alive slowly, with quiet purpose. I felt an odd sense of belonging among strangers who expected nothing from me. My phone vibrated again on the nightstand, but I ignored it. The constant noise from the past had no place here. I sipped my coffee, letting the warmth fill the silence. For the first time, I understood that peace wasn't something you found. It was something you stopped letting others take from you. After breakfast, I walked into town. The cobblestone streets were damp from the night's rain, glistening under the sun. Shops were opening, the smell of bread and salt drifting through the air. No one recognized me, and that anonymity felt cleansing. I stopped at a bookstore, bought a journal, and decided to start writing again. Not about pain, but about the life waiting beyond it. Each page I filled was proof that I had survived something I once thought would define me forever. My story wasn't about being left out anymore. It was about walking out by choice. By noon, I found myself sitting near the pier, watching the waves crash against the wooden posts. I imagined the resort hundreds of miles away, now just a faded scene in someone else's gossip. My sister would be facing questions she couldn't charm her way out of. My parents would be trying to rebuild what they refused to protect. And me, I was simply breathing, alive and unburdened. There was a strange comfort in knowing I had nothing to hide anymore. Truth doesn't need defending. It stands on its own, even when no one claps for it. As I walked back toward the inn, I passed a small art shop displaying paintings of the same lake I'd left behind. One of them showed a ballroom's reflection in the water, glittering under lanterns. I stopped and stared at it for a while. The image looked peaceful, but I knew better. I thought of how appearances deceive, and how easily people confuse beauty with goodness. I smiled faintly and kept walking. The world loved surface perfection. I no longer did. What mattered now was realness, even when it wasn't pretty, especially when it wasn't pretty. That evening, I bought a small dinner from a nearby cafe and took it to the beach. The sand was cool beneath my feet as I walked along the waterline. The sound of waves replaced the music that had once drowned me out. I realized that I wasn't lonely. I was alone, and there's a difference. Being alone meant space to breathe, to think, to exist without performing. For years I'd mistaken quiet for emptiness, but now I saw it for what it was, a blank page ready to be filled with something new. I felt ready to start again. I stayed by the shore until the sky deepened into a soft violet. The tide moved in gentle rhythm, calm but certain. I thought of my younger self, the version of me who tried so hard to be seen, who sat through every insult with a smile just to keep peace. I wished I could reach back and tell her she was never the problem. The problem was people who mistook her kindness for weakness. That realization didn't erase the pain, but it gave it purpose. Every scar I carried had turned into quiet proof that I had endured. I returned to my room, turned off the lights, and opened the window to let the sea breeze in. The faint hum of the ocean filled the space like a lullaby. Somewhere inside, a part of me still mourned the family I wished I'd had, the kind that celebrated every child equally, but the rest of me knew that longing for fairness in unfair people is like asking the sea to stay still. It won't. I wasn't bitter anymore. I was simply done hoping they'd change. Acceptance, I realized, wasn't surrender. It was release, and release felt like peace. The next morning, I woke to a sky streaked with gold. I packed my bag and took one last walk through the quiet streets. The world looked sharper somehow, as if I was seeing it without filters for the first time. Every color, every sound, every moment felt earned. My life was mine again, not borrowed or shaped by others' expectations. I didn't know where I would go next, but the uncertainty didn't scare me, it thrilled me. Freedom wasn't about having a plan, it was about knowing you could change it anytime you wanted. That was enough. On my way out of town, I stopped at a gas station cafe for coffee. The radio played softly in the background. I caught fragments of a local news report, something about a wedding scandal up north, a broken engagement, and a video spreading online. I didn't flinch. My hands stayed steady on the cup. It wasn't my concern anymore. The truth had its own journey now, and I had mine. I smiled faintly at the thought. Maybe people would never know who started it. Maybe they didn't need to. Justice didn't need credit. It only needed to exist. The road ahead stretched toward open countryside, framed by endless green fields. I turned up the radio slightly and let the hum of the tires fill the quiet. I thought about my sister again, not with anger but with distance. Maybe one day she'd face herself and see the person behind all that charm. Or maybe she wouldn't. Either way, her story was no longer tied to mine. I had carried her shadow long enough. Now I was standing in my own light, even if it was smaller, quieter, and unseen by most. It was mine, and that was enough. Hours later, I stopped at a rest area overlooking a valley. The sky was wide, the kind of endless blue that made you feel small but safe. I sat on a bench and watched clouds drift lazily across the horizon. Everything that had once felt urgent now seemed far away. The wedding, the drama, the years of being overlooked, they all belonged to another lifetime. What stayed with me wasn't bitterness, but clarity. I had learned that not every story ends with reconciliation. Some end with distance, and that distance is where peace begins to breathe. I took out the journal I'd bought in the seaside bookstore and opened to a blank page. The pen felt natural in my hand, steady and sure. I wrote about the sound of the waves, the smell of coffee, the quiet roads. I wrote about freedom and forgiveness, not the kind that excuses people, but the kind that sets you free from needing their apology. Each line felt like a small step forward. I wasn't rewriting the past, I was closing its final chapter. When I put the pen down, I felt lighter, like I'd finally stopped carrying ghosts. The next few days blurred into calm routines, small meals, long walks, quiet nights. I didn't rush anything. The world had moved at a frantic pace for so long that slowing down felt revolutionary. I realized peace doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives quietly, like sunlight creeping through curtains. Each morning I woke with no expectations to meet, and no roles to perform. It was strange at first, but then it started to feel natural. This was what living looked like, when you stopped auditioning for love that was never real. I had finally stepped off their stage. While sitting at a small cafe one afternoon, I overheard two women discussing a viral wedding story. They spoke in hushed tones, piecing together rumors and half-truths. I stirred my coffee slowly, pretending not to listen. Their words painted the same picture I'd imagined. The shock, the tears, the guests leaving in confusion. It had spread far, but I felt nothing. The story wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to those who needed drama. What I had taken from it was far more important: freedom from being their silence keeper. That trade had been worth everything. One evening, rain began to fall again, steady and rhythmic. I sat by the window, watching droplets race down the glass. The air smelled of salt and wet pavement. I thought of how storms used to scare me when I was younger, mostly because they made the house feel smaller. Now storms felt different, less like chaos, and more like cleansing. Every raindrop against the window reminded me that even beauty can come from breaking clouds. I didn't need the sun to feel whole. I had learned to find light in places that once only felt cold. By the end of the week, I had settled into a rhythm that felt like healing. Mornings at the harbor, afternoons writing, evenings spent walking until the stars appeared. The simplicity of it felt sacred. I no longer checked my phone or thought about who might be trying to reach me. I had stopped needing closure from people who thrived on avoiding it. Sometimes peace means choosing not to reopen wounds that others keep pretending aren't there. I had stopped expecting apologies. I had started building peace instead, one quiet, steady day at a time. I met a local woman named Nora, who owned the cafe by the pier. She had kind eyes and an easy laugh. She never asked about my past, and I never offered it. We talked about books, weather, and the ocean. Her calmness reminded me that kindness doesn't always come with questions. It can exist in simple presence. She lent me a novel about starting over and said she thought I'd like it. I thanked her and smiled. It was strange how strangers could show more care in 5 minutes than family could in a lifetime of shared history. That night, I started reading the book Nora gave me. It wasn't about family or revenge. It was about rediscovery. A woman leaves everything behind and finds herself by the sea. Each chapter felt like reading a reflection of my own life. I underlined one sentence that stood out. Peace isn't found in what's fixed, but in what's released. I closed the book and sat quietly for a long time. The line lingered, simple but true. Maybe I hadn't lost a family. Maybe I'd released one that was never capable of holding me in the first place. Days passed, and the tension in my shoulders slowly melted. I began waking before sunrise, watching the first light spill across the water. The world felt honest in those moments. No noise, no performance, no expectations, just existence. I started to understand that healing isn't a straight line. Some days felt peaceful, others uncertain, but even uncertainty felt better than the comfort of being unseen. Each sunrise was a reminder that new beginnings don't ask for permission. They just arrive, quiet and sure, waiting for you to step forward. I had finally learned how to step without hesitation. I visited the town market one morning and bought a small seashell necklace from a vendor. It wasn't expensive, but I liked its simplicity. It reminded me of balance, how fragile things can still be beautiful. The vendor said the shell had washed ashore after a storm, shaped perfectly by time and pressure. I thought about how much that mirrored life. Pain doesn't destroy you, it reshapes you. Every rough edge has a reason. Wearing that necklace, I didn't feel broken. I felt refined, molded by experience, into something strong enough to stay intact through the waves. While walking back, I passed a group of tourists taking photos by the harbor. Their laughter echoed. And I found myself smiling, not because I felt part of it, but because I didn't need to. Being unseen no longer hurt. Invisibility had turned into freedom. I thought of all the years I'd tried to earn visibility in rooms that had already decided not to see me. Now I didn't crave their gaze. I only cared about seeing myself clearly. The difference was everything. I finally understood that peace isn't given, it's claimed, and I had claimed mine fully. That evening, I wrote in my journal again, this time about gratitude. Not for what had happened, but for what it taught me. I was grateful for the courage to walk away, for the strength to stay silent when silence carried meaning, and for the wisdom to stop chasing what was never meant to hold me. I didn't erase the past. I just stopped reliving it. Each word I wrote felt like another step toward wholeness. My handwriting looked steadier, my thoughts clearer. I closed the journal and whispered to myself that I was proud, and this time I meant it. Later that night, a message came through my email from an old friend who had heard about the wedding. She didn't ask for details. She just said, "I hope you're okay." It was such a simple sentence, but it carried more care than 100 apologies from family ever could. I replied briefly, thanking her, and left it at that. Sometimes healing isn't in explaining your story. It's in knowing someone sees you without needing to understand every chapter. That small connection reminded me that not all relationships fade when truth arrives. Some begin because of it. I walked outside before bed and stood near the edge of the dock. The moon cast silver light across the water, bright enough to see the ripples move. The ocean seemed endless, yet calm. I thought of the past like those waves, constant, but no longer consuming. It would always be there, but I no longer needed to stand in it. I could simply watch it move and stay dry on the shore. Peace didn't mean forgetting. It meant remembering without pain. That was a kind of power I never knew I had, until now. I went back inside and turned off the lights. The room was dim, but it felt warm, safe, and mine. The sound of waves carried through the open window, steady and reliable. My story had reached its quiet turning point, not an ending, but a beginning I hadn't realized I'd been walking toward all along. I wasn't angry at my family anymore, not even my sister. I was just free, and freedom, I learned, doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers through calm nights by the sea, reminding you that peace isn't found, it's created, one choice at a time. The following morning, I walked to the shore just as the sun was rising. The air was cool, carrying the soft scent of salt and seaweed. I watched the first light spill across the water, turning the surface gold. Every new day felt like a quiet victory, proof that peace could exist after storms. I had spent years surviving chaos, learning to shrink myself to fit into silence. Now, I didn't need to shrink anymore. I had space, air, and calm. The world hadn't changed, but I had, and that made all the difference. A few days later, I received a message from my father. It was brief, only saying that he hoped I was safe. For a moment, I debated replying. Old habits still tugged at me, the instinct to soothe everyone else's discomfort. But I realized he wasn't asking how I felt, only ensuring the family story remained intact. I closed the message without responding. Silence wasn't avoidance this time. It was choice. I didn't owe explanations for peace. I'd earned. Sometimes not answering is the clearest way of saying, "I'm done being part of your noise." I took long walks through the town each morning, learning its rhythms. The locals greeted each other by name, sharing smiles without pretense. No one asked who I was or where I came from, and that anonymity felt like a blessing. I became part of the background in a way that felt comforting instead of painful. There was beauty in being ordinary, in blending into a world that didn't expect performance. Each step on those quiet streets reminded me that I didn't need to prove my worth anymore. My existence was enough, simple and whole. At the cafe, Nora waved when I walked in. She poured me coffee without asking. Already knowing my order, small gestures like that meant more than any grand apology ever could. They were proof of connection built on presence, not expectation. I sat by the window, reading and writing while sunlight warmed the wooden table. Outside, life moved steadily, boats leaving the harbor, children running along the pier. It all felt balanced, real. I wasn't watching life from the hallway anymore. I was living it quietly and freely, in a space that finally felt like mine. Later that afternoon, I walked to a nearby cliff that overlooked the sea. The wind was strong, pushing my hair across my face, but it felt cleansing. From that height, the water below looked endless. I thought about everything I had left behind: the resentment, the longing, the years of waiting to be chosen. I had spent so much time trying to prove I was worthy of belonging, but belonging built on conditions isn't love. It's control. The realization hit gently, not bitterly. I didn't lose a family. I released one that never truly had room for me. The next few nights brought rain, steady and comforting. I would sit near the window with my journal, listening to the soft rhythm outside. Writing had become my nightly ritual, a space to untangle thoughts without judgment. I wrote about forgiveness, not for them, but for myself. Holding on to hurt had only ever kept me tied to people who thrived on it. Letting go didn't excuse their behavior. It simply meant I refused to carry their weight any longer. Each page I filled was another piece of the past I no longer had to revisit. I began to dream more vividly, not of the wedding or my family, but of open roads and quiet homes filled with sunlight. My subconscious seemed to mirror what I was becoming, someone no longer defined by hurt. When I woke, I didn't feel dread or guilt, just calm curiosity for the day ahead. Healing didn't look like triumph. It looked like ordinary mornings that didn't ache anymore. Every sunrise reminded me that moving on isn't an act of running, it's an act of returning to yourself. I was finally back where I'd always belonged, within my own peace. One afternoon, a local newspaper left on a cafe table caught my attention. The headline mentioned a high-profile wedding scandal involving deceit and broken vows. I skimmed the story, recognizing enough details to know it was about my sister's event. The article painted it as a tragedy, but to me, it was closure. Truth had done what I couldn't. It revealed itself. I folded the paper and set it aside. I didn't feel the urge to gloat or explain. That story was theirs to manage now. Mine had already turned the page long before the world caught up. I walked to the docks and sat on a bench overlooking the water. The sky shifted between soft blue and gray as clouds drifted overhead. I thought about how people often chase happiness like it's something to capture, but real peace doesn't chase. It settles quietly when you stop running. I didn't have wealth or family pride or grand applause, but I had serenity, and that was richer than anything they had ever offered me. Every wave against the shore reminded me that life continues, no matter who walks away. That thought filled me with gentle strength. I decided to stay in that town longer than planned. Days turned into weeks, each one softer than the last. I got to know the locals: the baker who hummed while kneading dough, the fisherman who sold his catch at dawn, and the librarian who remembered everyone's favorite author. Their small kindnesses rebuilt something in me that years of family neglect had eroded. Love didn't need to be loud or elaborate. Sometimes it was a cup of coffee waiting, a friendly nod, or someone remembering your name. Those quiet gestures healed more than grand words ever could. One morning, I walked along the pier just as the fog began to lift. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of salt and wood. A fisherman waved and asked if I wanted to help pull in the nets. I agreed. The work was simple but grounding, the kind that reminded you life didn't need to be complicated to feel meaningful. When the net came up heavy with silver fish, he laughed, saying it was a lucky catch. I smiled, realizing luck had nothing to do with it. Some things come to you only when you stop forcing them. As weeks passed, I started painting again, a hobby I had abandoned years ago. My small room became cluttered with brushes and half-finished canvases. Most of what I painted was the sea, endless, shifting, and alive. Each stroke felt like reclaiming something I'd forgotten about myself. I didn't paint to be praised. I painted because creation felt like breathing. The same silence that once hurt now nurtured. In its stillness, ideas flowed freely. The quiet I had once feared had become my most loyal companion. I no longer needed approval to create. I just needed space, and I had that now. One evening, Nora stopped by the inn with a pie she had baked. She said it was for no reason at all. We ate together in the small dining room, talking about everything except the past. She asked if I planned to stay permanently. I told her I didn't know yet, but the thought no longer filled me with anxiety. Uncertainty didn't scare me anymore. It felt like freedom disguised as possibility. Sometimes life doesn't give you clarity before you leap. It gives you wings once you do. For now, that was enough. Staying or leaving would both be peace. When I walked her out, the night sky stretched wide above us, filled with stars. The ocean shimmered in the distance, reflecting the moonlight. I stood there for a while after she left, breathing in the cool air. I used to believe peace came after everything was fixed. Now I knew it came after accepting that not everything needs to be. Some stories end quietly, without closure, without forgiveness, without applause, and that's still an ending. I smiled, realizing that maybe the best kind of ending is one where you stop waiting for anyone else to write it for you. The next morning, I received a letter in the mail. It was from my mother. The handwriting was shaky, the envelope worn. I sat on the porch, staring at it for several minutes before opening it. Inside was a short note. She wrote that she hadn't known how bad things had been, that she wished she'd listened more. The words should have comforted me, but they didn't. They felt like a half-truth, written out of guilt. I folded the letter and placed it in my journal. It wasn't forgiveness, I felt. It was finality. Some bridges aren't meant to be rebuilt. That night, I reread old journal entries from before the wedding. My handwriting looked uncertain, almost timid, filled with questions about my worth and purpose. Comparing them to what I wrote now felt like meeting two different people. The old me had lived for validation. The new me lived for peace. Growth wasn't loud or visible. It was quiet, steady, like the tide returning to shore. I realized healing doesn't erase the past. It changes how you carry it. I wasn't erasing my history. I was honoring it by refusing to let it dictate my future anymore. I went for a late walk by the shore, the moonlight spilling across the sand. The tide was low, leaving behind small pools that mirrored the stars. I stepped carefully, feeling the cool water around my ankles. Everything felt simple, stripped of the noise I used to live in. I realized I didn't need to go back to prove I was okay or strong. Strength isn't about returning. It's about moving forward even when no one watches. I was done performing resilience for others. This quiet independence was strength in its purest, most peaceful form. As I walked, I thought about the word family. It used to mean duty, guilt, and obligation. Now it meant something else entirely. Family could be people who met you halfway, who listened without defense, who stayed because they chose to, not because they had to. My definition had changed, and I was grateful for that. Blood may connect you, but it doesn't guarantee care. I had found more genuine warmth in a town of strangers than in a lifetime of shared walls. Love built from choice would always mean more than love demanded by tradition. One morning, I saw a group of children building sandcastles on the beach. Their laughter carried across the water, carefree and full. I sat nearby, sketching them quietly. Watching them reminded me how unguarded joy looks, messy, loud, and unashamed. Somewhere along the way, I had learned to silence mine. Now I wanted to unlearn that. I didn't need to be careful anymore. Joy didn't have to be earned. It could just exist. I smiled as a wave washed away part of their castle, and they started rebuilding it without hesitation. That was the kind of spirit I wanted again. Over time, I began to feel like part of the town. People greeted me by name. They asked about my art, offered recipes, and shared stories about the sea. I found comfort in their ordinariness, the lack of performance or pressure. They didn't see me as the forgotten sister or the background figure. They saw me as me. Every day felt like quiet evidence that life continues beautifully after rejection. I had built something my family never gave me, belonging that didn't depend on hierarchy, status, or guilt. It was small, but it was real, and that was everything. I decided to host a small art display at the cafe. Encouraged by Nora, the townspeople came, admiring the paintings of sea and sky. No one asked for meaning, they just felt it. As I stood there, surrounded by gentle conversation and appreciation, I realized I didn't crave recognition. I only wanted connection. For years, I thought being seen meant being accepted. But now, I knew being understood was enough. That night, I went home with an empty heart. But in the best way possible. The emptiness wasn't loss. It was space ready for peace to live freely. As days passed, I stopped thinking about my sister entirely. The last thread that tied me to her had quietly unraveled. I didn't hate her. I didn't wish her harm. I simply stopped giving her space in my thoughts. She was part of a story that had ended. My new story had no villains or victims, just lessons. I no longer needed closure because peace had already closed that door. Freedom wasn't about forgetting her. It was about remembering myself. That realization felt like exhaling after holding my breath for years. My silence had turned into strength. I took my journal to the beach one evening and wrote one final entry about everything that had changed. I wrote that peace isn't given by others. It's something you claim when you finally stop chasing validation. I wrote about how quiet can feel heavy before it feels healing, and how truth can hurt before it frees you. My handwriting was steady, confident. When I finished, I signed my name and closed the journal. It wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of one where I no longer needed to explain myself to be understood. That night, as I lay in bed, the sound of the sea filled the room. I thought about how far I had come, from sitting outside by the trash bins to sitting by the ocean, surrounded by peace. The difference wasn't luck. It was courage. The courage to walk away, to stop fighting for a seat in rooms that never valued me. The person I was back then wouldn't have believed this quiet joy was possible, but it was. Peace didn't find me. I built it, step by step, choice by choice, until it became part of me. The next morning, I woke early and watched the sunrise paint the water in soft pink and gold. The world felt still, and for once, I didn't feel like an outsider looking in. I was simply here, part of it. I made tea, opened the balcony door, and let the wind brush through the curtains. Everything smelled like salt and new beginnings. I had learned that walking away wasn't an act of anger, it was an act of self-respect. I had walked out of a wedding, but more importantly, I had walked into my own life. I decided to spend the afternoon painting near the cliffs again. The wind was strong, tugging at my canvas, but I didn't mind. Each brushstroke felt like a heartbeat, steady and alive. I painted the sea, the horizon, and a small figure walking along the shore, a quiet reminder of who I had been and who I had become. The colors blended easily, calm and certain. I didn't need perfection anymore. I only needed honesty, and that flowed freely now. The painting wasn't just art. It was a mirror, showing a version of me that had finally come home. That evening, I took the finished painting to the cafe. Nora hung it near the window without question. People stopped to admire it, saying it looked peaceful. I smiled, knowing they were right. Peace was exactly what it held, layers of it built through pain, truth, and silence. It wasn't a masterpiece, but it was real, and that was enough. Watching strangers look at it with calm appreciation felt like a full circle. For years, I had been unseen. Now, even quietly, I was being seen in the truest way possible, through something I created without fear. As the days passed, I realized that healing doesn't announce itself. It simply arrives one morning, tucked inside routine moments. I noticed it when I woke without tension, when coffee tasted richer, when the sky looked brighter. The absence of heaviness was the proof. I had spent years waiting for an apology to make me whole, but wholeness came from myself. The past hadn't vanished. It had softened. I could remember everything without pain now. That was the quiet victory no one had witnessed but me, and that was what made it sacred. I visited the harbor again and sat on a bench watching the tide roll in. The air carried distant laughter from tourists, the kind of laughter that used to sting but now felt warm. I realized I could witness joy without comparing it to my own. I wasn't measuring my life anymore. I was living it. The water shimmered under sunlight, steady and endless. I thought about how waves never stop coming, yet each one disappears peacefully into the shore. Maybe life was meant to be the same. Constant change, steady acceptance, no resistance, just flow. I decided to write a letter I would never send. I addressed it to my sister, though I knew she would never read it. I wrote that I hope she found clarity, not punishment. I hope she learned that love isn't control and that manipulation always unravels. I didn't forgive her for what she did, but I no longer wished her harm. I signed my name and tucked the letter into my journal. Some words are meant only for release, not delivery. Setting them free felt lighter than I expected, like exhaling after holding something too long. The next morning, I stood barefoot on the sand and let the waves reach my ankles. The water was cold, but grounding. I looked out at the horizon and thought about the road that had brought me here. Every painful moment had led to this quiet morning, to this feeling of complete stillness. Growth didn't always look like joy. Sometimes it looked like calm after exhaustion. I closed my eyes and let the sea breeze move through me. For once, I didn't need to think ahead or look back. This exact moment was enough. I met a traveler who stopped at the pier to rest. He asked about local spots, and we ended up talking for an hour. It wasn't romantic or remarkable, just genuine human connection. He shared his own story of leaving behind noise and starting fresh somewhere quiet. Listening to him reminded me that pain and renewal are universal. Everyone carries something they had to walk away from. I didn't share my story in return. I didn't need to. He saw the peace in my voice, and that said enough. We wished each other well and parted calmly. Later that day, I walked into the small church at the edge of town. It wasn't for religion, it was for quiet. The sunlight filtered through stained glass, scattering color across the wooden floor. I sat in the back pew and listened to the creak of the building settling. It reminded me of myself. Weathered, but standing. I didn't pray for answers. I simply whispered gratitude for surviving long enough to see life through gentler eyes. Leaving pain behind hadn't made me empty. It had made me spacious, ready to hold peace without letting it slip away. When I stepped outside, the afternoon air felt warm against my skin. I walked through the town square, now familiar with every face. Children played near the fountain, vendors called out prices, and a street musician played something soft and steady. The world kept moving, as it always does, but I no longer felt behind. I had caught up, not to them, but to myself. I no longer felt like a forgotten sister or invisible daughter. I felt like a woman who had rewritten her story in her own handwriting. It wasn't perfect, but it was finally true. That evening, I sat on the balcony, watching the sunset burn orange over the water. I thought about how life had a strange rhythm of giving and taking. I had lost connection with my family, but gained connection with myself. I had lost illusion, but gained truth. Maybe balance wasn't about keeping everything. It was about letting go of what weighs you down. The horizon glowed brighter before fading into dusk. I didn't feel sadness. I felt gratitude. Losing them hadn't broken me. It had returned me to who I was before they convinced me I wasn't enough. The quiet of the night brought reflection. I remembered the moment at the wedding when I stood up and walked away. It had seemed small at the time, but it had changed everything. That walk wasn't just through a hallway. It was through years of silence. Every step had been an act of rebellion against invisibility. That memory no longer hurt. It felt sacred. Sometimes the most powerful choices are the simplest ones, the kind that rewrite your story without anyone realizing it. I smiled to myself, realizing that was the day I truly began living. I started painting again the next morning. This time from memory, not of the wedding, but of that hallway, the narrow walls, the faint smell of cleaner, the soft echo of music behind the doors. I painted it not with bitterness, but with understanding. That hallway had been the final test, the line between the person I was and the person I became. As I brushed in the last stroke of light through the doorway, it felt symbolic. What had once been humiliation was now transformation. Pain had become art, and art had become peace. I hung the new painting beside the first one at the cafe. Nora said it looked powerful, like a story captured in stillness. I didn't explain it. It didn't need explaining. People came and went, pausing to look, nodding quietly. Their silence said more than words could. It wasn't about recognition. It was about resonance. I realized then that healing has a ripple effect. The peace you build for yourself often touches others without you knowing. Maybe someone else would see that painting and remember that leaving isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the only way to survive with grace. That night, I wrote a list in my journal, titled What I've Learned. It wasn't long, just simple truths. That peace doesn't come from apology. That silence can be power. That family isn't who shares your blood, but who shares your heart. That walking away can sometimes be the most loving act of all. Writing it down felt final, like sealing a chapter. I didn't feel the need to burn or hide it. I closed the book gently and placed it on the windowsill beside the seashell necklace, two small symbols of the life I'd chosen to build. The next morning, I took a small walk along the cliffside trail. The sea below sparkled in the sun, stretching endlessly toward the horizon. Every gust of wind carried a sense of freedom. I could feel deep in my chest. I realized I didn't just survive my story. I transcended it. Every wound had taught me something about strength. Every silence had taught me something about voice. Standing there, I understood that peace wasn't the absence of noise. It was the presence of self, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid to stand in my own stillness. Weeks turned into months, and life settled into an easy rhythm. The scars from my past no longer felt like reminders. They felt like proof. Proof that I could rebuild from anything. People in town began calling me the artist by the sea. It made me smile every time. I had an identity now that wasn't tied to comparison or family roles. I belonged to my own story, shaped by truth, not expectation. The sea outside my window moved endlessly, its rhythm matching my own. I was no longer waiting to be loved. I was living love itself. One evening, while watching the sunset, I received a letter postmarked from my father. Inside, he wrote only one line. I understand now. There was no signature, no apology, just that. I stared at it for a long time, unsure how to feel. It wasn't closure, but it was something. Maybe he truly understood, or maybe he just wanted to believe he did. Either way, it didn't change my peace. I folded the letter and placed it with my journal. Understanding didn't need to come from them anymore. I already had it, and it was enough. As autumn arrived, the air turned cooler, and the waves grew rougher. I loved the sound of them crashing, powerful and alive. It reminded me that calm and strength can exist together. People often mistake peace for fragility, but peace is forged through storms. It isn't delicate, it's durable. I had weathered every emotional tide that tried to drown me, and I was still standing, steady as the shore. I no longer wished to forget the past. Remembering it without pain was proof of how far I'd come. Every storm I'd endured had built this unshakable calm. One day, a young woman came into the cafe while I was sketching. She looked lost, sitting alone in the corner. I offered her a seat at my table. She thanked me and began talking about feeling unseen by her own family. Her words mirrored my own past in ways that surprised me. I didn't give her advice. I just listened. Sometimes being heard is the first step toward healing. When she left, she smiled for the first time that day. I realized peace isn't meant to be kept. It's meant to be shared quietly, without demand or pride. That night, I thought about how life had come full circle. I had once been the girl sitting in the hallway, waiting for recognition. Now I was someone offering space to others who felt the same way. The transformation wasn't loud or dramatic. It was simple, steady, and real. I hadn't just healed. I had become a safe place for others to begin their healing. It struck me that maybe that's what peace truly is. Not isolation, but connection built from understanding. The world hadn't changed much, but my place in it finally made sense. I returned to the cliffs the next day with my sketchbook and sat near the edge. The horizon looked endless, and the air carried that familiar smell of salt and possibility. I began sketching the sea again, tracing lines that felt like memory and movement. This was my sanctuary, the place where silence wasn't emptiness but space for creation. I thought of how long it had taken me to arrive here, not just in distance but in heart. Every step had been necessary, every heartbreak essential. The calm I felt now was earned, not given, and that made it sacred. That evening, I watched lanterns being released over the harbor for a local festival. The sky filled with soft lights drifting upward, tiny stars against the night. People cheered as each one lifted higher, carrying wishes they'd never say aloud. I whispered one too. Not for change, but for continuity. I wished for this peace to stay, for my heart to remain open, and for my past to stay quiet behind me. Watching those lanterns disappear into the sky, I understood that letting go doesn't mean losing. It means trusting that what's meant to stay will find its way back. I walked home under the lantern-lit sky, the streets glowing faintly. My reflection followed me in the dark windows, and I hardly recognized her anymore. The sadness that once lingered in my eyes was gone, replaced by quiet steadiness. I wasn't waiting for anyone to see me. I saw myself clearly, fully, without needing validation. That was the kind of freedom I used to believe didn't exist. I smiled as I reached my door, realizing I had created it on my own. The life I had once begged for was now the life I lived effortlessly. Inside, I lit a candle and sat by the window. The ocean was calm again, its waves soft under the moonlight. I thought about the past one last time, not with anger, but with respect. Every version of me had done her best to survive. The girl in the hallway, the woman on the road, the artist by the sea, they were all the same person, finally united. I had walked through humiliation, truth, and silence, only to arrive here, with peace, steady as the tide. I whispered thank you to the quiet. It had always been leading me home. The morning after, I opened my journal and wrote one last line. I walked away from them, but toward myself. Then I closed it, placed it beside the seashell necklace, and stepped outside. The horizon stretched wide, painted in gold and silver. Waves lapped gently at the shore, steady and sure. I smiled, knowing that life would continue to move, sometimes kind, sometimes rough, but always forward. I wasn't the forgotten sister anymore. I was the woman who chose peace over approval, truth over silence, and freedom over fear. And this time, I wasn't walking away. I was walking home.